As the smallest state in the US, Rhode Island has a history of doing things its own way, but also of having events there disproportionately affect the rest of the country. But how did it come to exist as such a small unit in the first place? To find out, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Rhode Island. People have been living in what is now Rhode Island for thousands of years. One of the earliest archaeological sites in the state, the Jamestown Archaeological District, places human occupation of roughly 3,000 years ago. In more recent times, we know that the future state was inhabited by three distinct peoples, the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Neantic. All three spoke a variation of Algonquian, lived in extended family groups, and did not build permanent settlements as they relocated with the seasons, moving inland during the colder months. They lived on wigwams and ate beans, corn, and squash, as well as fishing and hunting wild game, and used wampum, a traditional shell bead, as a means of exchange. Of the three, the most powerful in what would become Rhode Island were the Narragansett, a tribe that received tribute from the other two, and whose name is believed to translate to the people of the little points and bays. As it happens, they were also the first individuals to encounter Europeans. This happened when Giovanni da Verrazzano, a Florentine navigator sailing under the flag of France, came across Narragansett Bay in April 1524 and made contact with them. He described the natives in a letter to the French king as the most beautiful people with long black hair, bronze color, and larger size than us. He also wrote that one of the islands in the bay was in size like the island of Rhodes, full of hills and covered with trees. The allusion to Rhodes, however, was not the basis for the future state's name. Rather, it probably came from the next recorded European visitor, Adrian Block, a Dutch navigator who explored and mapped the bay in 1614, and who called the largest of its isles Rhode Island, Dutch for Red Island. Whether this was because of the color of the clay on its shore or its foliage is unclear. Roughly 6 years later, the British would first settle in Plymouth, some 50 miles from the modern Rhode Island state line, and continue expanding their footprint throughout what is now Massachusetts. Two of those colonists, Stephen Hopkins and Edward Winslow, first explored the region around what is now the town of Warren in July 1621, and because of the great relationship they had with Chief Massasoit, the sachem or chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy who controlled the area, were able to set up a trading post in 1632. Another one of those original British colonists, William Blackstone, the first European to settle in Boston, was also the first European person to make the modern Rhode Island territory his home. Blackstone did so largely because although he had negotiated for himself a nice land grant in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he, being an Anglican, did not get along with its Puritan leaders and thus opted to move further west in 1635. The place he ended up establishing himself was in what is now Cumberland, near the Blackstone River, which bears his name. Around a year later, the Dutch established two trading posts in the future state, the first in what the locals now call Dutch Island, and the other at Fort Ninigret, a fortification named after the sachem of the Neantics, two outposts that would continue to see Dutch presence for the next 2 decades. That same year, yet another British colonist, Roger Williams, and a handful of others arrived in the area. Williams, a Protestant separatist, had originally lived in Massachusetts Bay Colony, but almost immediately got into trouble with the local authorities, not least because he questioned the right of the Puritan colony to exist without buying the land from the natives first. As he also preached ideas contrary to the Puritan religious view of the world, he would be convicted of sedition and heresy and banished from the colony in 1635. Still, given that he was ill and winter was approaching, the Massachusetts authorities allowed him to stay temporarily, provided that he ceased publicly teaching his opinions. Williams, not surprisingly, refused to comply and in January 1636 fled west in the middle of a blizzard. He would then buy land from the Massasoit and along with a handful of others would first settle in what is now Rumford. When William Bradford found out, however, he promptly sent Williams a letter informing him that his group was still within the jurisdiction of the Puritan colony, thus prompting a new relocation. This time, Roger Williams moved down the Seekonk River and settled in the area between Fox Point and what is now the confluence of the Mashasauk and Woonasquatucket rivers, a land they bought from the Narragansett chief Canonicus. Convinced that it had been divine intervention that brought them there, Williams named his new colony Providence Plantations. Of course, the fact that all of these colonists could find so much seemingly empty land for suitable settlement in the first place was because the earlier arrival of Europeans also brought contagious diseases which decimated them. Indeed, it is estimated that as much as 90% of natives could have died in the 1610s. Meanwhile, what would become the state's historical pattern, that of events within its territory having a disproportionate effect elsewhere, would first start during this period. The first case was the killing of John Oldham in Brock Island in July 1636. Oldham had gone to trade with the Pequot natives in the island, but instead he found death at the hands of the indigenous people along with 5 of his crew. Oldham was famous for being a difficult person, so he may well have instigated the event. Whatever actually happened, however, the homicide was the precipitating event of the Pequot War, as Massachusetts would then send a punitive expedition and further conflict would ensue, leading to the near wipeout of the Pequot people in Connecticut. Within a few years, there would be further settlement in the future state. Another group of dissidents, this time those led by Anne Hutchinson, were banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and opted to establish themselves at Aquidneck Island in 1638, after Roger Williams talked them out of going to New Jersey, which is where they intended to go initially. The town they founded, Portsmouth, was named like its more famous namesake to the north after the one in England, and was ruled by the Portsmouth Compact, a document aimed at formalizing the religious freedom they intended for their settlement. Within a year, there were further disagreements, however, and some of the original founders decided to establish yet another settlement, this time in the southern part of the island, which they called Newport. In 1641, Samuel Gordon also ran into trouble with the local authorities and left for the mainland. There, he bought land around Shawomet at the mouth of the Providence River from the local sachem, Miantonomi. However, 2 other sachems, Sakonoko and Pumham, claimed that they should have been consulted and that Miantonomi had no right to sell the land, making the transaction void. The sachems then took their case to the Boston authorities, where they placed their land under Massachusetts rule. In response, the Bay Colony sent a militia to arrest Gordon and brought him back to Boston after a tense standoff. Faced with banishment, Gordon managed to sail back to England, where he was able to gain a charter from the king for Shawomet. The person instrumental in gaining that for him was Robert Rich, the 2nd Earl of Warwick, so when Gordon returned to New England in 1648, he decided to rebaptize his town with that name. In the meantime, continued harassment from the Bay Colony convinced Roger Williams that it would be best to band the towns together to protect themselves, so he obtained a charter in 1644 that united the colony with the official name Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. He did not consult the island towns, however, so there would be competing charters until 1663, when King Charles II united them and enshrined religious freedom to its people. This continued to attract dissidents, earning it the nickname Rogues Island from its critics. Cotton Mather, the man most famous for drumming up the hysteria behind the Salem witch trials, called it the sewer of New England. And maybe because of that, the colony continued to grow. Williams purchased the land of what is now Washington County in 1658 and Woonsocket in 1661, and as it did, its encroachment on native lands, just like other parts of New England, led to conflict with indigenous people, which would eventually result in what came to be known as King Philip's War. The immediate catalyst for armed hostilities was the killing of John Sassaman in 1675, a native convert to Christianity, which paved the way for escalating reprisals between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Wampanoag. This in turn would lead to a punitive expedition against a native outpost at Mount Hope in what is now Bristol. The colony of Rhode Island tried to remain neutral in the conflict, as did the Narragansetts because of their relationship with Roger Williams. But once the New England militias massacred the Narragansetts at the Great Swamp Fight in 1675, the natives responded and burned Providence, including the house of Roger Williams, and did extensive damage to Warwick. When the war finally ended with the capture of Metacomet, the self-styled King Philip, at Mount Hope near Bristol, the economy of Rhode Island had been shattered. About 1/10 of its population had been lost, and the Wampanoag and Narragansett were decimated. Some were sold into slavery, and the Wampanoag were effectively left without land. Roger Williams died in 1683. 3 years later, the British Crown, aiming to streamline administration and to more effectively monitor their trade, created the Dominion of New England, which unified the entire region plus New York and New Jersey into a single administrative unit. This was short-lived because of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 back in England, which deposed King James II, but it did accelerate a process of resentment against the Crown, which would fester over the next century. In the meantime, Rhode Island grew richer, in large part because of its role in the transatlantic slave trade. The colony had actually been the first in British America to have any kind of anti-slavery law when it passed a municipal restriction in 1652, but this was never really enforced, and it was then superseded by a 1703 General Assembly law that legalized slavery. This made Providence and Newport booming ports as they became part of a very profitable triangular trade that brought enslaved people to the Americas, sugar to the colonies to make rum, and then rum back to Africa to pay for those that were enslaved. This brought many kidnapped Africans to Rhode Island, so that by 1776, some 6.3% of the colony's population was enslaved, the highest in New England. It also made many families rich, like the DeWolfs, the largest enslavers in Rhode Island, and John Brown, a man that would be instrumental in the founding of Brown University in 1764. This trade also made Rhode Island quite sensitive to the British Parliament's passage of the Molasses Act in 1733 and the Sugar Act in 1764, taxes that would have severely hampered the profitability of the rum trade. This in turn led to increasing anger at the Crown, which resulted in the boarding and burning of a Royal Navy schooner that was attempting to reduce the smuggling to avoid those taxes in 1772. Known as the Gaspee Affair, it, coupled with the Boston Tea Party, convinced Parliament to pass what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, a series of measures aimed at bringing the colonists, especially Massachusetts, to heel. Instead, it provoked the American Revolution. Rhode Island was heavily involved in the conflict. It declared itself officially independent from the Crown on May 4, 1776, 2 months before the rest of the colonies, and provided generals like Thomas Holden, Ezekiel Cornell, and Nathanael Greene, the latter a key officer in the defeat of the British in the South and their eventual surrender at Yorktown. Rhode Island also created the first non-white military unit, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Unfortunately for them, they also suffered much violence, most prominently during the Battle of Rhode Island in August 1778. The post-war years brought a new government, the Articles of Confederation, a system which Rhode Island liked because it gave it a say disproportionate to its size. Indeed, when other states set up a convention in Philadelphia to improve the system, Rhode Island not only refused to send anyone, but even after a new constitution was drafted, its citizens voted to reject it, the only state to do so. In the end, it took until May 1790, over a year after George Washington was sworn in, for Rhode Island to become the 13th state to join the Union. It would not be the last time the state would refuse to go along with the others, delaying the ratification of direct Senate election for 100 years, rejecting the 16th Amendment's establishment of an income tax in 1913, and declining to ratify the Prohibition Amendment in 1919. That same year of 1790, the state would again return to a pattern of disproportionate importance to others. That was because Samuel Slater, a British immigrant, began the first water-powered textile mill in the United States at Pawtucket, initiating an American Industrial Revolution that would soon spread nationally. The wild success of the mill paved the way for Rhode Island to become one of the most industrialized states in America, producing not just textiles but also machine tools and silverware. One of its companies, Brown & Sharp, founded in 1833 in Providence, created a number of industrial standards that revolutionized production to such an extent that they are still in use today. This industrial revolution also created massive demand for labor, which grew Rhode Island's cities and attracted many immigrants from Ireland. The newcomers also brought political tension, however. Rhode Island had never written a new constitution, and by 1841 was still ruled under the precepts of its 1663 Royal Charter, which severely restricted the franchise to landowners, so that around 60% of the men in the state could not vote. In response, Thomas Dorr, a local representative, drafted a liberal constitution in 1841 that was ratified by a popular vote, but which the existing Rhode Island government, led by Governor Samuel Wirt King, refused to recognize. He then declared martial law. Dorr refused to back down, and along with his supporters attacked an arsenal in Providence in May 1842. The attempt failed, however, and when Dorr realized his forces would lose to the state militia, he backed down and fled the state, but would eventually be imprisoned for a year. The conservative faction, meanwhile, although victorious, changed their mind and allowed near-universal male suffrage in the state constitution, including for black men. Notably, the 1842 charter would also abolish slavery. As this became the dividing political issue of the mid-19th century, Rhode Island became increasingly anti-slavery. It not only had a number of outspoken abolitionist leaders, such as the Buffum Chase family, Edward Harris, and George L. Clark, but also played a role in the Underground Railroad, with Pawtucket and Providence as safe houses for runaways. Thus, not surprisingly, when the Civil War came, the state strongly supported the Union side, sending some 25,000 men to the battlefront, of which roughly 1,600 never returned. Its sitting governor at the time, William Sprague IV, even participated in the first Battle of Bull Run in Manassas, Virginia, as an aide-de-camp to General Ambrose Burnside, although immediately after he returned to Providence. Just as importantly, the state's industrial capacity was crucial in the construction of cannons and other war materiel. In the next several decades, and roughly until the outset of the Great Depression in 1929, Rhode Island would continue its upward prosperous trajectory. It would see double-digit percentage increase in population every decade from 1870 to 1930, going from 174,620 people in 1860 to 687,497 individuals 70 years later. It also saw the founding of multiple colleges and universities, the most important of which were Rhode Island College in 1854, the Naval War College in 1884, and of course the University of Rhode Island in 1892. In addition, this era produced one of the most significant 20th century authors of supernatural horror fiction, H.P. Lovecraft. Born in Providence in 1890, Lovecraft was not famous during his lifetime and had to wait until the 1970s for his books to gain traction, but now is more popular than ever. Meanwhile, Rhode Island's industrialization continued to expand, and by the 1890s, the Providence area alone had more than 1,500 factories, and the state accounted for more than 1/4 of the entire national jewelry production. Rhode Island also became a playground for the rich during the Gilded Age, as many of the era's plutocrats ended up with a home there, especially in Newport, where you can still visit them dotting the sides of Bellevue Avenue. This period was dominated by the Republican Party, who controlled not only the governor's mansion, but also the state legislature, with only a handful of exceptions until 1932. In addition, between 1881 and 1911, one of its U.S. senators, Nelson W. Aldrich, would become one of the most important politicians in the country, whose leadership paved the way to establish the Federal Reserve in 1913. Not to mention the slashing of duties that allowed Americans to import fine art, becoming the seed of many a museum collection in the U.S. Industrial prosperity continued to attract immigrants. Italians, Portuguese, and French Canadians joined previous waves of Irish, so that by 1910, some 15% of the population in the state was foreign-born. Providence was a popular destination, but not the only one. Places like Woonsocket had the 6th largest concentration of French Canadians in the country, while Kent and Coventry had around 30 and 25% respectively of people who were foreign-born. Not that everyone was thrilled about this. The high number of Catholics in particular prompted the presence of the KKK, who had multiple rallies and events in the state in the 1920s. The Great Depression ended this upward trajectory with a vengeance. By 1932, the worst year during that period, some 32% of people in the state were unemployed. Textile and related industries, which had already been in decline since about a decade earlier and had already faced serious strikes like the New England Textile Strike of 1922, entered a death spiral. The Depression also ended the Republican control of the state. With their newfound power, the Democrats passed a number of unemployment policies and poverty relief. But most importantly for the future, they changed the law to reapportion the Senate. Previously, each town in the state was granted a senator regardless of population, making Republican power so complete that even when they managed to get elected, Democratic governors were basically figureheads during this period. The Democrats changed it so that the Senate would be much more closely aligned to the state's population, although it's still not purely proportional as is the House. And as it happens, Democrats have controlled the chamber since 1959 and currently hold a supermajority. Although World War II placed the state on a more sustainable economic path, the prosperity of some places did not return. Providence in particular saw a massive flight to the suburbs from the middle class, with a population decrease second only to Detroit in the country between 1940 and 1970. The building of the interstates in 1956 made it even worse, leading to the demolition of hundreds of homes and dozens of businesses. Those left behind were disproportionately poor and in need of social services. As a result, the city became a notorious bastion of organized crime, famously led by mobster Raymond Ellis Patriarca, who continued to run the family business even from behind bars. It didn't help Providence's image that its mayor, from 1974 to 1984, Buddy Cianci, was forced to resign after being convicted of a felony for beating and torturing some poor guy. Since the 2000s, the state has returned to an upward trajectory as its economy has moved into the education, healthcare, and tourism sectors. Providence itself has been called the Renaissance City for its major efforts at revitalization since then. These efforts coincided with the return to office from Cianci in 1991, but he was then forced to resign yet again because of another felony in 2002. Cianci ran again in 2014, but was beaten by Jorge Elorza, the first mayor of Central American descent in the history of New England. Elorza is a sign of a larger trend in the state, as Latinos are now over 16% of Rhode Island's population, especially Dominicans and Guatemalans. and thus the tiniest state in the Union continues to reinvent itself.